forestière à l'ISFORT parce que pour nous, Charlie représente un peu un des pionniers de la recherche en forêts feuillues tempérées. C'est pour ça que je suis sûr que vous avez tous lu des articles, des choses que Charlie a fait. Et moi, j'ai l'honneur en fait de le connaître depuis assez longtemps. Quand je suis revenu de la Colombie-Britannique, j'ai commencé ma carrière à l'UQAM. Très rapidement, je me suis intéressé au modèle SORTIE. Et à un moment donné, j'avais contacté, puis on a descendu d'aller le voir avec Marie-Lou Baudet. C'est là qu'a commencé notre collaboration. Donc, Charlie travaille au Cary Institute, qui est basé au nord de l'État de New York. Et c'est un institut assez spécial parce que c'est un institut privé qui est fondé surtout par une donation d'une famille très riche. Donc, une bonne partie de l'argent vient de cette fondation-là. Ils doivent évidemment chercher de l'argent eux-mêmes. Donc, ils sont à peu près une quinzaine de chercheurs. Je dirais que ça ressemble un peu à ce que l'ISFORT est en termes de nombre de personnes et d'interaction. L'idée, c'est d'interagir ensemble et de faire des projets qui vont être utiles pour la société. Donc, ça ressemble beaucoup aussi à ce que l'ISFORT veut faire. J'ai regardé un peu son CV ce matin parce que des fois, j'oublie que Charlie, c'est pas juste un écologiste forestier. Je regardais seulement la liste de choses qu'il avait mis. Bon, écologie forestière, mais aussi écologie des maladies. Il a beaucoup travaillé sur le lien entre l'écologie et le Lyme disease en particulier. Et aussi l'écologie aquatique. Depuis les 5 dernières années, avec un de ses collègues, avec un petit avion, il a étudié beaucoup de lacs en Amérique du Nord. Donc, en train de développer des choses sur l'écologie aquatique. Et dans les dernières années, une des choses qui caractérise Charlie, c'est beaucoup les analyses statistiques, comment analyser les données et les nouvelles approches statistiques, donc tout ce qui touche, vous avez entendu parler de likelihood analysis. Charlie a donné plusieurs formations, dont ici à Québec l'année passée, mais un peu partout dans le monde. Et je pense que c'est aussi un des pionniers dans ce domaine-là. Donc, évidemment, c'est un très grand plaisir aujourd'hui de l'accueillir. Et j'ai trouvé que ça serait intéressant qu'il nous parle un peu globalement comment il voit les changements globaux et les menaces possibles des changements globaux par rapport à la forêt feuillue tempérée. Donc, c'est un peu ce qui va nous entretenir. Et vous allez voir, il y a une vision un peu différente de ce que plusieurs d'entre nous avons de ces problèmes-là. So we have to do it in French now.
No, I've been working with Christian for many years, and if he wasn't so polite and has let me work in English with him all these years, I probably would be doing this in French.
I like that.
So he does the introductions in French, so I won't know if he's saying embarrassing things about me, but since you weren't laughing or leaving, presumably he said nice things. Thank you, Christian. It's a pleasure to be here. I've spent many years going up to the offices in Montreal at UQAM, and I have to say this is much more my natural environment. The Cary Institute is in a very rural location, very much like this, and it's always suited me very well. When I have to, I can take the train into New York City. I try to limit that to about twice a year. So I'm going to talk about the work I'm doing right now. In many ways, it's sort of wrapping up the last 30 years of research. I've been at the Cary for 30 years, and it's a long time. And what I'm really going to talk about is sort of 3 related projects that I'm doing at the moment. And I never leave my office. No, I have to go downstairs when one of those computers dies or gets hung up. So this is all done with very large data sets and modeling, and a model that I've worked with Christian and students here in Quebec for many years, and with Dave Coates in BC. But it's basically trying to look at a whole host of different human effects on forests. And to be honest, the one in the middle there, the climate change stuff, came up just sort of, the real initial focus was to try to think about the impacts of pests and pathogens. And then the forest biomass energy production angle came up because there's a big push by many of our politicians to promote biomass energy as a market for our low-grade wood in our forests. And then the climate change angle sort of came out of nowhere. I had agreed to do the work for APHIS, our Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. And at the last minute, as we were signing the contract, the program officer said, and of course you'll put climate change in the model. I said, well, I hadn't really planned to do that, and so then I had to go to NSF to get funding for that part of it. But so the whole point of this work has always been to link field research and modeling, and even though at this point the field research I link in is all done by the U.S. Forest Service through their National Forest Inventory Network. Basically my whole career I've been sort of disciplining myself to figure out how to collect field data and use it in models. And when I started this work, I started it because Steve Bacala came to give a seminar, and he had been studying competition between grass and clover in the lawns at the University of Connecticut. All his work was very theoretical, elegant models, but he never had to leave the front lawn in front of his building on campus. He was tired of that. And I've been studying utility rights-of-way, actually tree invasion on utility rights-of-way. In fact, that's why my very first trip to Montreal was for a conference on this. I got to go to an Expos game. And I was tired of that, and so we took this walk, and Steve was a modeler, and I was a real hardcore field biologist, and I despised all of the models. I thought they were all garbage, and these folks didn't understand forests, and their models were silly. And but I've learned, and so this is a caricature, but there's still some of this sentiment out there. Models are very hard to do, and they're very hard to convince people to accept. And the modelers have a point here. Quite often, the field researchers just want to go and they pick what they want to study, and they're going to study it, and whether or not it actually helps the modeler was not their reason for being. But the point of this, of the work that we started back at this beautiful forest in Connecticut in 1990, a place called Great Mountain Forest. It's about 30 miles from the institute where I work. A beautiful spot of about 7,000 acres of private forest land that a family had bought 100 years ago and had been managing as working forest all those years. And we're happy to make it available to researchers. But we set out to sort of deliberately and simultaneously develop both the model, which we called SORTIE, and there it is right there on the door. It was a play on words. I've told this story, many of you have probably heard this, that the previous model we were trying to replace was foray, and in English, foray, F-O-R-A-Y, is to go forth, as is sortie, and the model does a whole lot of sorting of records, and then the first time I came up here, I realized it also meant exit, obviously, which was not intentional. So we basically had a very good group of graduate students, and we sat down to deliberately design new field methods so that we could measure the things we knew we would need in the model, and we restricted the model to basically deal with exactly what we could get from the field. And it was a great project. We had good students. It was a lot of work. Steve and I would sit there in my office and try to figure out what to put in the model, what to throw out. Quite frankly, we put things in the model that we knew we had to put in because otherwise the field biologists wouldn't pay any attention, even though we knew it probably didn't matter. And then 10 years later, we could systematically say, simplify and take them out. But it was great fun. And then after that initial model, I spent a good chunk of the next dozen or so years of my life with a whole series of projects at Great Mountain Forest. And I probably can't remember any of the results except I remember the people. And those of you who have advised students over the years, it's the people. I tell a story. The young man second down here married Jackie. Jackie I had hired as a research assistant when she was our babysitter. She grew up down the street from me, and she used to babysit her older daughter. I hired her to run a field experiment in a greenhouse one year, and then she was a co-author on that paper, and they were both working together, and I was sitting in the field vehicle, and Chris turned over and looked at me and asked for my permission to propose to Jackie. I said, okay. Marriage lasted about 5 years, and now they're both happily remarried with lovely families. Actually, at their wedding, as this was outside at the Institute, at the end of the ceremony, a thunderstorm moved in and lightning struck and destroyed the tree in front of everybody. So we thought the gods had spoken. But this was just, basically Steve moved on to other things to work on global carbon, but there were still, after that initial model, there were still lots of things that I thought mattered about understanding tree population dynamics. And this was just great fun. I mean, there were a lot of nice papers, and very little of this actually ended up in the model. So, for instance, all the work that Jackie and Chris did on rodents and deer, we've never built in. We have all this wonderful work on seed predation, seedling predation, browsing by deer. But to be honest, the story from the field research was so obvious that it seemed sort of belaboring the obvious to build it formally into the model. Although, as I'll talk about in a second, I then went on and did work in New Zealand where the rodents and the deer were the whole story. Those forests had been devastated by introduced deer, and of course the rodents were major predators on their native bird species. And so we put extraordinary work into trying to model the dynamics of the rodents and the deer. That paper is in press in Ecological Monographs. It's 200 pages long. No one will read it, but it was an awesome amount of work and very depressing. New Zealand's one of the most depressing places on the planet if you're a conservation biologist. Beautiful, but really intractable problems. Lorena, some of you must know Lorena. One of the best postdocs I've ever had. I've had two postdocs, two Spanish women as postdocs, the most productive postdocs I've ever had. Lorena came on a Fulbright, and in 24 months had submitted 3 papers, including a paper on allelopathy that I still think is a marvel. At any rate, so that occupied me for quite some time. And then right around the same time, I first met Christian and actually Phil Burton. Some of you know Phil is with the Canadian Forest Service, isn't he still? Phil, I'd actually tried to hire as a postdoc when he finished his PhD, but he went off to Canada, and he invited me out for a seminar, and then had Dave Coates take me up to Dave Creek, and I started working with him, and soon after that I started working with Christian. And it turned out this model, SORTIE, we had developed it for purely theoretical reasons, but it's almost certain that its best application is in sustainable, or at least partial harvesting, silviculture. All that vast investment in growth and yield studies for even age management really doesn't help you if you go to partial harvesting. And Dave had that wonderful Dave Creek experiment. There was lots of work here in Quebec with Domtar and others thinking about partial harvesting, gap phase dynamics. And the model seemed, a reasonably apt or appropriate tool for that. And then actually I started the work in New Zealand because Elaine Wright, who was with the BC Forest Service, had moved back to New Zealand, and that started that. And then friends got me involved in Puerto Rico looking at hurricanes, which I got out of as quickly as I can. It's hot and wet, and I don't mind cold and wet, but hot and wet. It's just, field work was really miserable, to be honest. And so there are two things that went through all of this, and to be honest, I'm spending a few minutes building up so that you will believe the results I'm going to show you in a few minutes. So that's why this is also, to be honest, a little trip down memory lane for me. And so one of them is this whole set of methods revolving around likelihood estimation as a framework for inference and for fitting statistical models. Basically, I learned these methods from Steve Picala, and then early on, there was no commercial software, statistical software, that would really let you do this well, particularly for spatial models. And I like to program, and so I developed software of my own to do this, and then eventually Maria Uriarte, the other Spanish postdoc, she's an American citizen and a professor at Columbia. Maria said, Charlie, why do you just keep teaching this to your students? Let's teach it to students, or to your students, let's teach a course in it. And I realized I couldn't, the graduate students don't learn to program anymore, but R is a really useful frame. Are most graduate students using R now? Yeah, I'm really delighted to see it, and it frustrates the heck out of me because I am dismal at R. I was trained in very traditional, Fortran, C, Pascal, and I have a full-time programmer, Laura, and she lives in Kansas City, but is on Skype, and so I'm constantly stuck in R, and it's embarrassing. I have to ask Laura for help. But the whole framework of likelihood is just, I think is a very powerful tool for taking your data and then asking hypotheses, asking questions by fitting models. And almost all of this involves, that's not a pointer, this notion of thinking about forests in a neighborhood context. And so when I walk through the woods, if I want to study nitrogen mineralization, I stop and I look down and I ask what's happening here and how can I explain that based on the configuration of the forest around this point. So I work at an Institute of Ecosystem Studies, and the true ecosystem scientists, they all use 10 by 10 meter plots and they average. The problem is you can't, if the species mix changes, how do you predict the change in ecosystem properties? Whereas if you can build up an understanding that says, well, you know, what's happening right here is because there's a maple of that size there and an ash over here and an oak over here, and there's some footprint of those processes. You can actually build up an understanding of ecosystem processes that you can link to community dynamics. But all of these things have these models tend to have these summation terms in them, and those require some programming. And in R, you can do that. R is incredibly slow. It's about 2 orders of magnitude slower than a compiled language for this kind of thing, but it's still doable, and with computers, you don't have to pay by the hour. So the last course I taught, in fact, was at Mont Saint-Hilaire last spring. It's been a year and a half now, and I just haven't gotten to scheduling another one. And the other is basically the programming of the model. And so the original model was written in C and was just hard-coded and run on an IBM PC. And then over the years, you know, like I remember when Mary Lou told us that the allometry we had for sapling radius, the crown of a sapling, was completely wrong and was completely misrepresenting what beech was doing in the understory. So we had to change the functions in the model. And she was absolutely right. She had very good data on this, that beech is unusual. It's the only tree I've ever measured where if you give it more light, most trees will angle their branches up, and it helps reduce too much illumination and allows deeper penetration of light into the crown. Beech does just the opposite. You give it more light and it grows like this, and it grows laterally and basically crowds everybody out. And this came out of an early project of Mary Lou's. And so for the first 5 or 10 years of the model, we just kept adding things to the code. And after about 5 years of that, we realized the code was completely unstable and it was very hard to debug and test. So we threw it out and we came up with a new architecture, Laura and I, basically just trying to figure out how could we make this thing flexible so that anybody could add something new to the model and be able to test and make sure it worked properly. And so there is this, it's all on the web, the programmer's guides, the source code, the sample files are all on the website. And we're constantly adding new things to the model. Laura was working on a new change to be able to capture beech bark disease effects. We needed to add a new term to the model, and we just went over that Wednesday, actually. So she's doing that change right now, and new runs of the model will start next week. So that's my introduction to get me to where I am now. So these are my study sites. The gray plots, the gray dots in that upper right figure are FIA, the U.S. Forest Inventory and Analysis Network. I think it's mostly provincial, and there must be some federal plots, not really. It's mostly provincial. In the U.S., this is done by the U.S. Forest Service at a national scale, and they have a very regular system of inventorying forests. The area we use the data from those eastern 32 states, and then we model just these northeastern 22 states. The reason is that I have no idea what's going to happen in southern Georgia because we don't have any data from anything south of there. So if you're asking what's going to happen under climate change, we don't even know where the species are going to come from. Whereas if you ask me what's going to happen in the state of Kentucky, home of our new majority leader, Mitch McConnell, and his coal industry, I can use the data from southern Georgia because those are in climates 3 to 6 degrees warmer, and so I can actually think about asking questions about this region based on analysis of a much lower temperature. So this is just, I've actually never seen a diagram of what Quebec uses as the design, but there are similar, and many countries now have networks like this where, these are the details of the system used in the U.S., particularly in the East. In the West, they're only remeasuring about every 10 years, and I actually think it's because they're so worried about what they're going to find that they're going to have to shut down forestry, particularly with mountain pine beetle. If they do a calculation of net growth after subtracting out all the mortality, the feds actually have to get approval from the states to do an inventory in the state. And I think some of the states, frankly, are just terrified of what they're going to find. And so there are very, very few remeasurement data from the West at the moment. But it's just a simple network of plots. They come back every 5 to 7 years and remeasure the seedlings, saplings, and trees. They do a little bit of soils work, a little bit of other things, but basically just measurements of birth, growth, and death of trees. So the first step, although this was about 3 years worth of work, is really just pulling all this information together. So you can download the FIA data from the website. It's readily accessible. There are about 375,000 plots. I forget how many million tree records. And they go all the way back some time, although in the US, they instituted a new design in 1999, and so the data from before then can't be easily incorporated. I have a way to do that, but I typically work on the data after that. Climate, we use a standard US system called PRISM, which comes out of Oregon State, which is an interpolated climate data product. I'd done some previous work looking at the effects of air pollution, nitrogen deposition on tree growth. We actually estimate that biomass increment in the northeastern US is about 45% higher than pre-industrial levels because of the effects of nitrogen deposition. So that's in the model, and we have a national network of atmospheric monitoring that gives us data on nitrogen deposition. And then just use standard soils and topography data to do water budgets for the plots. Now, in the US, the plot locations are secret by law, but researchers can get a security agreement to get the true plot locations. I just can't reveal the plot locations, nor could I even show you a map of the previous scale with those plot locations. And there are obvious reasons for this. They want landowners to give permission to have these crews come on their land, but they don't want the landowners thinking, well, I don't want someone to know what I have on my property or what I've done to my property. And so the confidentiality turns out to be important. But it's actually a felony if I mistakenly release the plot locations. So information is locked up in a safe and can't be on a networked computer out of knowledge. So once you've got all that in hand, there's a core set of basic functions you need to predict the dynamics of tree species. I just want to give an example of one. A lot of you have interest in forestry and silviculture. This particular example comes from a paper in Applications a year ago, and it basically is sort of an example of how we pretty much do everything. When they remeasure those plots, they mark whether a tree was, quote, removed, which means it was cut and taken from the site. If it was cut and just left to fall, that's actually not a removal or a harvest in their parlance. So we probably have a slight underestimate of the logging effect. But so basically, a silviculturalist would ask, could I look at all those plots and say what kinds of silviculture were practiced? Unfortunately, we don't practice silviculture in the U.S. anymore. We cut trees down, and whether or not it fits into some neat silvicultural system that an academic forester has come up with is sort of irrelevant, because most harvests in the U.S. are not done with the services of a professional forester. They're done by loggers and owners, and that's just the way our system works these days. So you can look at it statistically and ask, can I characterize what's happening at a very large scale across all these plots? And so there are two things to predict. The first is a plot logged? And then if it's logged, how much was taken and which trees were taken? And so this paper essentially develops it's essentially a form of logistic regression, a two-part regression in which you do fit those two parts simultaneously to the data. And then, this is an example of the kinds of independent variables that would predict whether the plot is logged, and if logged, how much is removed. And if you look at those, they're not really biological parameters. They're socioeconomic parameters. They're, what were the landowner's intention? What kind of landowner? How far to the nearest road turns out to be a big issue. And particularly if you're doing partial harvesting, you don't do it if it's more than 500 to 1,000 feet from the nearest road because it's too expensive. And for instance, we tested local human population density because where I live, there's a lot of public opposition to logging, and so logging tends to happen, you would think, where there aren't a lot of people around. It turns out that in the models that was not a significant effect. I think if I had better measures, for instance, if we knew where mills were, we could probably say, how close are you to the nearest mill? Does that influence? So a lot of the work I'm doing now is actually working with sociologists to try to refine these models Because for us, half of our forests are owned by small parcels owned by private landowners for whom economic return from that is like the fifth thing on the reason why they own the land. They own it for aesthetic reasons, or to hunt, or to hike. And somewhere down there is to get some economic return. Most of them would say they actually don't harvest their forests, but when you look at the records, most of them do harvest their forests. They don't consider, for instance, firewood cutting to be logging, but most of these forests are in fact cut for some level. So just as an example of what this looks like, this was a picture I took while flying around sampling lakes in the Adirondacks. So statistically, if they were practicing even-aged management, you'd have sort of these two curves. You wouldn't harvest until you had something to harvest, and then the probability of logging would rise up pretty quickly, and how much you took would, again, if there wasn't much there, you wouldn't bother to go in and harvest, and as the stand matured, you'd be likely to take all of it. Well, what's really happening? So this picture in the lower left is that same location, and I actually think they probably just did this because there was a forester and he was bored with partial harvesting and he wanted to try a big patch cut. I have no reason why they did the patch cut, but the real unit was really embedded in a big partial harvest. And so, if you look at the probability of logging, there's an awful lot of logging that happens on stands with very little basal area. So that, for instance, the second removal of a shelterwood cut would qualify. But if you're high grading and just taking big sawlog beech or cherry, you're still going to log even when there's not much basal area there, if that's what you want. And then how much you remove is pretty much flat. The mean doesn't vary. Now there's enormous variation in this. You can go everywhere from a clear cut to taking to a firewood cut, in which you only take 5%. So that's really statistically what the pattern is out there. Now it varies with forest type, it even varies with state because of legal prescriptions. And so those are sort of key functions. So why is it important? Well, there's sort of a narrative, a myth, if you will, in the northeastern US these days that our forests are done growing and that they've matured and we have to start logging them more heavily to get them to grow faster. And part of this is being fueled by the ecologists. So for instance, Hubbard Brook, the famous site in New Hampshire where many of my colleagues have worked for 50, 60 years, Hubbard Brook has stopped growing. So in the last 20, 30 years, it has stopped accumulating biomass. But Hubbard Brook is right on the curve where a northern hardwood forest on those soils should sort of stop accumulating biomass. And it hasn't been logged in 100 years, and it wasn't heavily logged even 100 years ago. But it's not representative of the rest of the landscape. These are histograms across plots in each state of the above ground biomass, and you'll see that states like Maine up there in the upper left corner, there are almost no mature stands left in Maine. Logging has been so heavy, and so much of the landscape. The reason there's not much carbon accumulation on the current northeastern forest landscape is because actually we're cutting so heavily. We're cutting almost all of net growth, and all the stands are actually being pushed past peak yield down into this part of the curve, where if you keep cutting, you actually push that landscape into a lower and lower productivity region, as opposed to being out here, where when you harvest a stand, you push it up into a higher productivity part of the curve. So these curves are just like fishery stock recruitment curves, right? You'd rather be on the uphill side of that thing than on the downhill side. Because if you're on the downhill side of that curve and you increase your intensity of harvest, you just drive the system further towards extinction. And a lot of the eastern US is unfortunately on the downhill side of that curve because harvesting is frankly much higher than the public understands. So, and these are the kinds of other issues that we're trying to tease apart right now. We've got landowners around us. Emerald ash borer is in our county. I was talking to one of our board members last year who owns some forest land, and he had just cut all the ash trees off his property. So he was trying to avoid the economic loss. Is that really what you want to have happen or not? There's not much evidence of genetic resistance to emerald ash borer, but if there was some, cutting them all down would eliminate them. And so And then the third one here is really interesting. There's a lot of talk, should landowners be changing their management of forests in anticipation of climate change? So does that mean either bringing in southern species, or does it mean trying to, make the current residents more resistant? This assisted migration debate, I don't know if you guys are having it, but it's being tested in various places where, should you be planting southern species and southern genotypes after you harvest? It's a big debate in the conservation world about whether this is, should we be trying to help nature along or trying to help it stay the way it is? And then this is in many ways the most interesting story for us, because our estimates of sustainability in harvest depend on knowing how much of the forest is actually available for harvest. And when we look across the landscape, we estimate that about a third of our forest is, for a variety of reasons, mostly socioeconomic reasons, not available. Now, if that land is not available for harvest, then we are currently over-harvesting the available working forest. So this is, again, an issue as much for the sociologists and the economists as for the ecologists. So in some ways that's, harvesting is the dominant driver, just to cut to the end of the talk, the dominant driver of change in these forests. But the climate change is politically the one that's most sensitive and the one that's caused me the most grief. Because to give you the story ahead of time, the model predicts almost no response of tree species in any meaningful, dramatic way to climate change over the next 100 years. So how do we do this? Well, we basically take all those climate data and do just the same thing. We try to fit models for birth, growth, and death, recruitment of seedlings, growth and survival of saplings and adults as a function of climate variables in models that incorporate climate and nitrogen deposition and competition and so forth. And we basically just do this for the 50 most common tree species in eastern North America. And this is one of the hardest things. So what climate variables? It's really sort of shocking how little theory or mechanistic understanding we have of what aspect of climate really should matter for tree growth. It's like the ecophysiologists about 20 years ago were converging on really good whole plant carbon models that would have told us the answer, and then they all moved off to something else, direct CO2 effects or something else. But there really is, so I'm frankly using mostly mean annual temperature and then a sort of a growing season precipitation or a growing season water depth, because I don't, if you ask dendrochronologists, people, they'll throw into their models, the monthly temperatures of the 18 previous months and try to fit these models with 50 different climate variables and look for the best fit. And I mean, I have to confess, it drives me a little nuts, because you will find a best fit. It's just whether that's really what drives growth. And so this is a huge problem. There's enormous room for improvement in our understanding of climate impacts on trees by figuring out exactly what climate variables matter for growth and survival. And it's probably different variables for growth than it is for survival. Just as an example, so one of the models, a model for growth of any one of those 50 species would have these sets of terms in it. A term for the ontogenetic effects of tree size. So how does potential growth vary with tree size? Turns out to be an enormously important variable in SORTIE. Competition, I've been doing these models for a long time with people here in British Columbia and in all sorts of sites. And that's just using simple neighborhood models. They're very phenomenological, but they capture the competition effects. Nitrogen deposition is a pretty straight, simple fit. And then I have to confess that I've tried dozens of different functional forms for the climate effect on growth, and I'm embarrassed by what we found. If I just showed you a scatter plot, you'd say there's absolutely no relation, and if you fit a spline to it, it would go like this. At first I was using simple Gaussian functions. I thought it'd be nice and bell-shaped, and I thought, no, maybe it's skewed. And then I'm working with a double logistic now that's infinitely flexible and produces just incomprehensible results. So this is an example. So for sugar maple, up there in the corner is the distribution in the U.S. Of course, it goes way up into Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. And here's its distribution in climate space. It's, in the U.S. it occurs well, basically as cold as we get, which is about 2 degrees mean annual temperature. It's about as warm. You got, so there are certainly parts of the St. Lawrence Valley that are 4 to 5 degrees mean annual temperature in the sea. And it occurs across a pretty broad range of precipitation. But here's the fitted function for the potential growth of juveniles as a function of temperature. Anybody believe it? That is the best fit. It's taking that out of the model and assuming there's no relationship is a worse fit. What could conceivably produce that pattern? I have no idea. And there are 50,000 data points behind that curve, right? So it's not like I don't have enough data. And I've tried dozens of different functional forms, and that's it. I mean, the adult one you could maybe believe as it gets warmer, the adults grow better, but it's actually, for sugar maple, it's the seedling response to climate that is much more strong and has a much bigger impact on its predicted dynamics. And those are, I don't even want to begin to explain that model, it's very messy. So for instance, balsam fir, a species you all know and love. This is maybe a little more typical and understandable. The dashed parts of those lines are extrapolation from where it currently exists into where it doesn't exist, but that it might experience those warmer temperatures. So for us, balsam fir really is a very northern species for us. And so its presence drops off drastically. I live at about this temperature, about 9, 10 degrees, and we just don't have balsam fir. But there's no way I can really explain balsam fir distribution based on the response of adults or juveniles to growth. There's a little bit of a response of the juveniles to moisture, but there's a little bit more pattern in survival, particularly for moisture, but you'd be hard pressed to argue that this curve gives rise to this pattern. This is the observed distribution. If anything, the juveniles seem insensitive in their survival, and the adults, maybe that is the key to the southern distribution of balsam fir. The seedling recruitment, again, does seem sensitive to temperature, even more sensitive to moisture, which matches with what the adults were doing. So, so I've got 50 of these species, and I've got several hundred of these graphs. I actually have dozens of these graphs for each species, and so I just sit there and click through them, trying to figure out what's going on. I mean, red maple, you certainly have red maple here, probably. It's the most common tree in the eastern U.S. by far. Sugar maple is second most abundant. So what's going on with its juveniles? I mean, they appear to grow the slowest right in the middle of its distribution, but that's what the data show. So there could be something confounding this. This might not be a climate signal at all, but there's not a dramatic response in either adults or juveniles, and almost no response to precipitation. But of course, red maple grows on the driest hilltops and swamps, so that's not a surprise. Survival, well, there's much more of a response, but I still have a hard time relating that to this. Maybe that's part of it. And so the problem is I've got this model that ties together all this demography, and there don't seem to be any simple answers for what controls the distribution of any one species. It's not just always seedling dynamics or just sapling sensitivity to climate or adults. They all have some level of sensitivity, and here's the recruitment. Seedling survival does seem very sensitive in red maple. So I pull all that stuff together, and then I plug it into the model. And an important point here is that SORTIE is a stand model. It takes, we typically run a 4-hectare plot, and it's done as a torus, so the edges wrap around, and it's spatial and individual based. And to get a sense of what's happening at the landscape, we just do 10,000 runs. And so what I do is I select 10,000 of these plots at random and initialize the model with what's right there now. And so what that means is I have two things. I have a representative sample of the landscape, and I've captured what past land use and environment has created as the mix of forests available to us now. And so, most models, what they do is they start with some hypothetical initial conditions, and then they spin the model up to equilibrium, and then they apply, say, climate change. But we know that land use legacies are incredibly important, and so by doing it this way, I can start with what we have now and I can take the results and I can break them down by state or forest type, multiply by the area of forest in that state or forest type, and have a reasonable prediction, or at least have a prediction for that I can scale up. And all of this is done with just buying with 100 cheap used computers. My lab is now just full of computers. So this is an example of the output. This is just actually for the 4 northern states from Maine to New York. This was for the biomass energy work. Ignore the green curves for a minute. That was taking the current harvest regime and intensifying harvest. So red is, the colors, I probably should have switched these around. Red should have been hot, but it's not. Red is the current climate and the current harvest regime by state and by forest type. And then blue is with climate change. And this is, I just broke out the results by forest type. And there are 2 sort of surprising things here. The first is just how much increase in biomass we predict. Because again, the narrative has been that, well, we've saturated our carbon storage and we've gotten all we're going to get out of the forest as far as carbon sequestration. And that's not at all true, and it's because of this misunderstanding of what the landscape is. The landscape is full of young stands, dating from heavy harvesting 50 years ago, and they've got a long way to go to mature. The other is that the gap between the red and the blue lines is pretty darn slim, right? Spruce fir makes sense. They're at the southern edge of their range in the U.S., and they show a bigger sensitivity to climate change. The way I should mention that what we've done here is we are implementing a 3-degree centigrade climate increase ramped up linearly over the first 100 years and then it plateaus. A purely hypothetical climate. But I'd be hard pressed to say that this is gloom and doom and the world is coming to an end for these forests because of climate change. And so this is an enormous political problem for me. So I can do this and I can publish this because I'm going to retire in 5 years. None of you could do this because you'd be hounded out of the field. And I'm sort of serious about that. I've spent a whole lot of time sort of struggling with the ethics of self-censorship. Part of me, there's some days when I figure I don't have to publish this. I could just retire with my reputation intact. And, we have such a problem with climate change deniers in the U.S., and we're going to have an even bigger problem after the elections last week. I think as forest ecologists, if you think about this, it can't be a big surprise that without stronger sensitivity of the tree species to climate, 100 years is nothing. We're talking 1 generation for these trees, and the trees present on those sites, big changes are going to have to come from colonization by new species, growing up in competition with what's there. We're just not seeing the kinds of rampant mortality due to climate that would be needed to produce really big results. So I'm very confident that this is actually what's going to happen, insofar as we can be confident about anything with forests. I mean, predicting the future with forests is a bit of a fool's errand. I can't predict the next pest or pathogen to arrive, or who knows what climate really will do. Just an example of, I just took, to give you some sense of what the species do, on the left there is just taking the northern hardwood conifer forest type, and just for the states outside of Maine. Maine is harvesting so heavily you get a completely different picture. And on the right is that same set of forests, same set of plots, but with this 3-degree. And the top blue line there is sugar maple, and it's projected to do well. In either case, it actually does better under climate change. This sort of purple color is red maple. Under climate change, it's projected not to do as well by the model, but white pine does really well. And it's because in our data, white pine actually likes temperatures a little bit below, a little bit warmer than what currently exists in this region. But most of the other species just sort of poke along. They're the minor species in the stand. You can pick out some changes. Beech actually does much better under climate change in this model. But remember, beech has the southernmost distribution of any of these species. It grows in Mexico. So again, it probably can't be a big surprise. And this is even with beech bark disease impacts sort of built into the model. These are not big, beautiful, healthy, mature beech. These are all scrawny, diseased, what we call beech hell. So what's behind sort of that big increase? Well, again, it's not so much a change in species mix, it's that this up above, this is the current distribution of biomass in the northern states of the US, Maine to New York. And again, I talked about Hubbard Brook. Hubbard Brook is right out here. It's not at all representative of the landscape. Much of our landscape is in these young stands. This is what the model predicts in about 100 years. Actually, a lot more late successional and old growth. If I sort out, for instance, the Adirondack Forest Preserve where there's no logging, over time, you give it another 100 years, and we could, the model predicts some really magnificent stands. It would be, I would like to be around and see those. But, and actually, the model predicts. So, for instance, if you talk to staff from Audubon, is there a Canadian analog of Audubon, a bird society? Well, so this is a group, birders are fanatics. I'm sure the Canadian birders are just as fanatic as the American birders. But so there's a whole society that gets a lot of donations from all those fanatic birders. And they've actually been teaming up with the timber industry because a lot of our bird species like this habitat. These early successional habitats, like spruce grouse for us, is a rare species because we're at the southern end of its range. And it tends to not like this and like this. And so we have a number of species that were common because of intensive land use in the past, bird species, and that are disappearing. So, when I show this to an Audubon scientist, they're concerned. I sort of think I've always loved old growth forests, so I'm sort of happy with this landscape, but the birders are not as happy. So, I've been talking fast. So.
Still have an hour.
I still have an hour to go. Christian promised me I had all afternoon, that you would be attentive and awake the whole time. This is a horrible time for the seminar. I would be sleeping. You guys have been great to stay awake right after lunch. It's really tough for me. So one of the interesting things is that, for instance, both red maple and black cherry, even in the absence of climate change, I didn't put these figures in, but their distribution along climate gradients changed because land use history has been different along that climate gradient, and it has had differential effects on those species. And the harvest regimes going forward are very different. The partial harvesting that's going on now is completely different than the intensive harvesting that happened over the last 100 years, and it leads to a change in the abundance of those species. And so black cherry is predicted to become much more abundant on the northern end of its range, and red maple much more abundant on the southern end of its range, even without any climate change, which I thought was sort of cool. And the other big story here is that this partial harvesting is really acting very differently than past, more even-aged intensive harvesting. So a lot more sugar maple, beech, hemlock, red spruce, much less in the way of red oak, ash. And red maple sort of sits in the middle and just sort of does well no matter what. You have to admire red maple. And we now can sell red maple for saw logs. So it's a desired species for kitchen cabinets now, of all things. So, the other thing is this notion that logging might actually be what allows southern species to migrate northwards by getting rid of the current residents. And there's enough logging going on that's not implausible. But this is the one that has people sort of interested is what's the sort of the human side of this, and to what degree will changes in landowner behavior. So what I'm doing with the model right now is I'm taking the current harvest regime and I'm just applying that going forward. We know that harvest regime fluctuates enormously. After the 2008 depression, harvests declined by 25% in the region, and they've slowly come back in the last couple of years. So, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen to harvests. But, I don't think this can be a surprise. So these species currently occur, most of them have a climate range that is 15 to 20 degrees centigrade from their northern to southern limit. So a 3 or even a 6 degree increase in temperature, is something, on any given day they can experience a 20 degrees centigrade diurnal range in temperature, going from, particularly this time of year or in the spring when a front comes through and, you swap out a tropical system that has come up the coast from a polar system like the one today. And I have to say that results of the model assume no dispersal limitation. We assume no limitation on dispersal. If the climate is suitable for seedlings of a species, we seed them into the model, and then they have and see what happens to them. And they just don't ever make it out of the seedling layer. This is sort of where I am right now. I think these eastern temperate forests, and I would say the same thing about the temperate forests of Europe and Asia, are probably the most resistant. I used to use the word resilient, but that's really not what this is. This is resistance, not resilience. It's not like we're pushing them into some other state and watching them come back. They're just not going to change in response to 3 or 6 degree increase in climate in the next 100 to 150 years. They would, and so some of us were talking about this before lunch. This has caused me to doubt almost everything I once loved and believed about paleoecology, that you could look at, say, a pollen record and reconstruct the climate of a region. I now think that forests lag climate change by hundreds of years, and if that's the case, how do you ever look at a history of change in tree pollen and assess what the climate was? And if the climate changes, how long does it take for the trees to equilibrate with that? And if you think about our theory, we have lots of theory for, say, temporal fluctuations in climate around a mean and say, recovery of ecosystems after disturbance. What we don't tend to have is a body of theory for a directionally changing environment, an environment that's going from here over a long time period to here, and thinking about how systems track that. And you can get all worked up about time lags, and are these forests going to be more vulnerable to pests and pathogens because they're out of sync with climate, and they're not quite comfortable, and so they're more vulnerable, and they're going to be more sensitive to this, that, or the other. And all of that could be true. I just don't have any science that's, to be honest, I am becoming more and more concerned about essentially confirmation bias, that we're all trying so hard to convince people to listen to us about climate change that we spend a lot of time looking for the catastrophes and not giving nature enough credit for resistance. But I certainly wouldn't be giving anywhere near the same kind of talk if I were talking about western U.S. forests, which sit on a knife edge between grassland and forest, and with changes in temperature and fire regime. Parts of, say, Yellowstone, if any of you have ever been there, this beautiful mosaic of grasslands and forests, where a single fire, the fires in '88, pushed some Engelmann spruce subalpine fir forests that had probably been forest for 1,000 years, and they're now grassland, and they're going to be grassland for 1,000 years. It will take that long for the trees to reestablish after such a hot fire. Those forests, unlike lodgepole and Doug fir, didn't burn much, and they were on better sites. But so this is sort of where I am. And I haven't really, I know, talking to Christian, emerald ash borer I know is a concern now up here. The real thing we're trying to do with this model is now ask questions about the pests and pathogens. For us, that's beech bark disease, hemlock woolly adelgid, and emerald ash borer. But one of the reasons that the federal government is funding this work is they think they can, well, we hope that the model could be used as a tool as a new pest or pathogen arrives. Could we make some assumptions about its hosts and what effects it has and its dynamics, and plug that into the model and say, well, what impacts might it have? So if you followed the story with emerald ash borer, you know that the U.S. spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to eradicate it in Michigan and Ohio and the Midwest where it first arrived, to absolutely no effect. It basically pissed off a whole lot of landowners. If the insect was found on your property, the jackbooted feds came in and cut down all the ash trees within 2 miles. And it cost a lot of money, and it alienated a lot of people, and it nearly bankrupted a lot of cities because all of their street trees were ash after elms died 50 years ago, and they had to come in and cut them all down. So they'd sort of like to know, what do we do? Is this how big a threat is something? And I'm actually a little ambivalent about this, because do you make a decision about how to respond to a new threat based on a model that I've worked hard to put together? I'm not sure how much responsibility I want for that. But there are lots of questions we'd like to now use the model to ask about recovery. I have to say that I think that, depressingly, the time course of recovery is going to be measured in millennia. We've done early simulations. For instance, remember, hemlock disappears from eastern North America 4,700 years ago for mysterious reasons. I think it was a hemlock looper, but Dave Foster is now trying to argue that it was a climate signal, which I think is just silly. I'm sorry, I love Dave, but it's just can't be. But when we plug that into SORTIE, it takes 1,500 years for hemlock to recover, which is about what shows up in the pollen records. But then we see oscillations in beech and hemlock population dynamics that play out for another 1,000 years, because that's just how long, you can take any stage structured population model and you can find oscillations like that in models when your generation time is 100 years. So unfortunately, the time course of recovery may just be entirely academic. From when I talk to the public about, well, it'll be okay, they're going to be back in 1,000 years, they look at me like I just sprouted 2 heads and I came from another planet. So there are big questions about resistance and what fraction of the population survives. But I have to say that I think that both beech, or all of the ashes, and hemlocks are going to go the way of elms. They're going to become rare but not extinct is the most likely scenario. And they're just going to become very rare elements in the landscape, replaced by something else. And then this is my last plea, is that, there's just, I have way too much data and way too little theory. If you're going to start fitting statistical models to 100,000 data points, I could justify by AIC or likelihood or goodness of fit a model with 100 independent variables, but it would be completely overspecified. And if I'm just doing that ad hoc and just picking, a fishing expedition among thousands of predictor variables, I'll get something that's entirely idiosyncratic and not really predictive. And we just, the single biggest thing that I think is missing, if any of you are tree geneticists, is I'm treating these species as uniform across their range. So is a beech population, is its response to temperature in Tennessee different than the response to temperature in Quebec? I actually know how to get at this, and so I give this pitch to any time there are people in the audience who do dendro work. So tree ring work could resolve this. If I could just get the tree ring people to, who's the student in the course from the tree ring? Jacob? There was a student in the likelihood course who was interested in tree ring work. He was brilliant. He was also an undergraduate. It was embarrassing.
Oh yeah, that's
Jacob. Wow. But there are ways, so you could take tree cores and use the temporal pattern in a tree core to say, is a core from a tree in Tennessee, does it show a different response to temperature fluctuation than a core from a tree up here? And so you just need to, I have to say that given the breeding systems in trees and gene flow, I'm skeptical that there's a lot of precise differentiation of populations across climate gradients. There's just too much. Topography means that you've got trees in warm climates and cold climates near each other. Most of these species are outcrossed, wind-pollinated species, and so I really doubt that there's a lot of genetic differentiation, but there's still lots of things out there that could change the story. So, and then this I've already talked about. I think there's a lot of room for good theory on just, nature's changing too rapidly. If there was a silver lining in all the climate change work, it's that we understand that the Earth has been this highly dynamic system, and we have a much better handle on, say, the quaternary climate variations since the end of the ice ages, and we don't really yet we have not yet thought about how vegetation, if it lags climate, just exactly how those climate fluctuations give rise to the kinds of time-lagged effects on populations, so that what we see here might be a unique effect of even something from the Little Ice Age, let alone the medieval warm, just persisting in population cycles that have periodicities of 1,000 years. So that's, there's lots of room here for good work. I'm going to retire before that gets done, so I hope some of you will do it, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Vous pouvez poser vos questions en français, je vais les traduire si vous ne voulez pas poser une question en anglais. Vous avez sûrement des questions. OK? I challenge you. Good.
I was wondering, it's not about climate change, but could you speak louder? Yeah, you were talking a lot about climate change, but you spoke only of temperature change. There is also precipitation, extreme events, and whatever else.
Yeah, let me, so most of the models, at least for the eastern U.S., predict a slight increase in precipitation. So these simulations included a 10% ramped up increase in precipitation. I should have mentioned that. You know, the extreme events thing is really popular right now. It's probably true for Western species. It's just complete BS for Eastern species. Show me any evidence of an extreme climate event in the last 100 years that has led to a large...
Is that BS?
At any rate, I'm sure there's a French translation. I just don't have, I see no evidence that climate, well, for instance, there have been a number of papers trying to look at climate variability rather than climate mean, and they find no effect on tree growth.
Yeah, I wasn't saying there was any, and I don't think, you know, we also always say a tree will stand better to the storm than a grass or whatever. I was wondering if you just put it in, or if you use the exact IPCC scenario or something like that.
Yeah. The model will be posted, all the parameter files. It's easy to use. And I've actually, this will drive me nuts, but I was going to just, get it all on the web and say, okay, suggest a scenario. We'll plug it in. It takes about a week to run 10,000 plots, and that's 5 terabytes of output that you can then go wade through and see if you can, we just use R to boil it down to some simple graphs. And so there are an infinite number of questions like that to ask. And again, some of us talked about this morning. I've gotten sort of jaded. It's just because I'm old and tired maybe, but there are just too many of these questions. It's so open-ended. It's like and this is why, if I had more theory, I could say, well, let's not do that one. Let's test this hypothesis. If we just test everything, it's going to get tedious. But there's certainly lots of people looking at that. And I just, it's become very popular. Lots of papers making it into science about catastrophic tree mortality worldwide. And I'm still a skeptic in the eastern temperate forests. I just don't have an example of any one of these species showing that big kind of regional. And the other thing is that I actually don't think mountain pine beetle is a big, significant ecological event. It's a lot of dead trees, but they're going to grow back as lodgepole pine, folks, or grassland. And that's interesting. But so a pulsed event by itself may or may not change the dynamics of the system. It will certainly reset succession, but it may or may not cause big changes in climate distributions and so forth. And so you need to play it out. And the model could actually do that.
Just to continue on this, just to make sure I understand you correctly. It was interesting, we had David Lindemeyer last week, and he will have given a talk that is almost the opposite of yours, about Australia.
Yeah, I heard his talk 2 days after
Right.
David.
He's talking about collapse.
Yeah.
Collapse because there's overlogging, there's climate change, all of these things.
He didn't show me any evidence of collapse. I go through this Chicken Little Pollyanna cycle where I'm either really depressed or I'm really upbeat, and I'm on
my
a
question
high
was,
lately.
I understand about the eastern temperate forest, but you will not say that this is true everywhere.
No,
right?
and as I said, I think there are lots of systems that are on much drier climates. I'm really not sure what I think about the tropics, because they're really, talk about a system with no variation in climate. And
They have this theory that we can shift from closed forest to savanna.
Yeah.
With a bit of change in precipitation.
and the work we've done in Puerto Rico doesn't help us get at that at all. So.
Just wondering, what do you mean by collapse?
Well, I don't know what Lindemeyer meant by collapse, because I listened to the same talk you guys heard, and I didn't see any collapse.
Well, he means a change of state. You go from one state, which is a certain forest with certain service and function, to another state where these are functions or services that we don't like, and it's very hard to go back. So you will
I have an example. Like when we think about white pine in the 18th century, we had a lot of white pine. And probably if you look at that landscape right here, you would have seen a lot of that white pine popping up everywhere. And giving that multi-story structure that we have no more of that structure in our temperate
Well, but you
forest.
have it in another 50 years.
And I remember your graph where you were showing that we're getting much more biomass in the future. I'm wondering if having the white pine coming back and making that new structure being back in the landscape. It's not just a response of something that we have changed. We have considerably changed that forest just because of that loss.
So, I guess, so you mean it won't come back, the pine? If you do
But
nothing?
look at the amount of propagals that we have in the landscape right now, and we have like 1 century of work to elect the white pine to come back, and we go in the reserve right here, we don't see white pine anymore.
It won't come back.
Boy, there's more white pine regeneration south of here than you can shake a stick at. It's amazing driving up the Northway yesterday. And red spruce, which we thought was going to disappear. But, so I think, it's a question of time scale for me. So calling it a collapse is, it seemed more alarmist. I think he's trying to motivate to stop logging the last of a very unique, wonderful ecosystem. So just go out there and buy the damn land and stop logging it. Well, it's all crown land, unfortunately. And I I had friends over from Monash University who actually live near me. They're here in the state of Cincinnati this week for dinner. And, there's not much left. It's only providing a couple hundred jobs. And they're going to go ahead and cut the last of those ash forests, those 120-meter tall trees for no good reason at all. And so I guess if he can mobilize opposition to that by calling it collapse, I don't have any problem with that. But ecologically, it wasn't a collapse to me. It was just, we over-harvested. So I guess I suppose you could say that's a collapse.
For me, the collapse, an example I had in mind is that we transform our hardwood forest into shrublands. Like maybe something that you see in beach tents.
Yeah, beach hell, I suppose that's a state change.
And what we see here, that we start to have the beach disease, and as I explained to you this morning, we have these, we have the maple that it seems still collapsing though. Its growth is decreasing. So I really wonder if we won't get shrublands like we see in some old partial cuts that have been done like, I would say, 30 years ago, and no, they did not recover from it. Some did, but many did not.
I mean, there are some very limited examples that I know of in the States where logging followed by incredibly hot fire gave rise to like these bracken fern communities that they take forever to regenerate. I mean, hundreds of years. Well, they've been still in bracken for 50, 100 years. And so I don't think that's an ultimate stable state. I think it's just a really, really slow return. Eventually, I think the trees will get back in there. But it's just my faith in trees.
I would tend to accept and agree with what you say that will come back whenever it is. Some will stay and some will come back sometimes. But it still matters that even though they come back in 1,000 years, it still means that for 1,000 years we don't have these resources and we don't have this access to everything.
It's just that at least in the States, the acreage of that kind of state is really limited. I can point you to one place in the entire Adirondacks. It's about 10 acres. It's very famous. It's really cool. It's actually really interesting. It's one of the few open habitats in the wilderness area where I did my PhD research. But so that's a good point, by the way. I mean, I get very academic. 1,000 years is nothing to me. So.
I'm wondering how much of the response that you're showing over the entire landscape is responsive from the human impacts. And if you added the human impact, you would have seen some other change related to climate change. It's easy to see that, okay, most of the impact is coming from the human influence, and climate is not important. But what is the compensating effect of the human? If you remove the human, you let only the climate change happen in the landscape.
Well, you'd have to tell me what the landscape looked like prior to humans.
No, but starting from our own point right now.
But what would you start with?
With the actual forest.
Well, the actual forest is the human impact.
No, but I mean in the future, like what you did with your model, you include both climate and human. And in the end, you're saying most of the change, none of, or very few is coming from the climate, most of it is coming from people. Is it just because you had the human in the model that did all the changes and the climate had like a playground to have its effects?
I'm not sure how I would tease that out. I mean, so should I? You have to start from somewhere, and I suppose you could spin the model up and let it run for 1,000 years and ask, with a stable climate, what would you get? And then you could use that as starting conditions, and that's what most people are doing. I just don't know. Again, that becomes an entirely academic exercise to me, because we know the human impacts will be pervasive. In other words, the legacy. These are systems with memory. So, what's going to happen over the next 100 years is, in many ways, the playing out of what happened in the last 100 years. And so that's true for wherever in your time slice you are. Whatever the age and size, structure, and species mix that you have at time t is a function and integration of t minus in the last 500 to 1,000 years, and it's going to influence where you go in the next 100 to 500 years. So I guess we could ask how different. So would the climate signal be larger? No, it actually wouldn't. It still wouldn't be bigger than the legacy effects of what you have right now. The successional dynamics would still be big, unless you had gotten to just a completely old growth landscape. I guess maybe that would.
Right. Yeah, you were surprised about the response of the growth, survival of anything with temperature or moisture, but you know that interaction takes place in these processes. And I was wondering if you test some combination, and I'm sure that maybe why ecophysiologists abandon that is because at two or three interactions it becomes like crazy.
These models are actually multiplicative, so in a formal statistical sense, I'm only testing the interactions between temperature and precipitation. That doesn't answer your question though, because there could be sort of nonlinear or very synergistic or antagonistic effects of those changes. And again, it's just there are too many possible interaction terms to put in, and so I've been reluctant to try that. It seems a bit too much like a fishing expedition. So I would rather have you tell me from first principles of physiology, Charlie, you should be, so for instance, if I had a really good carbon model and I could do an integration based on, I could feed in sort of information about the year and the combination of vapor pressure deficit and solar radiation and temperature, I could probably spin up a little carbon model for the tree, and that might predict growth by integrating across all those climate variables. And we could certainly marshal the computing power to do that, but I need it for 50 species.
Exactly, because you see that this 3-degree increase in temperature will not have the same impact depending if there is water in the soil or if there is no water in the soil.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you have the species level with phenotypic plasticity, which are not responding the same.
Really all this is a space for time substitution, folks. I'm saying, how well does a species perform in this climate? And if the climate now looks like the climate over here, I use what it's doing right here, right now. That's all it is. And so, there could be massive climate effects that would not show up in that. But you have to sort of assume a lot of genetic differentiation for that to matter. So that's the biggest weakness in the space for time substitution. And then the other is just that if there are, in that big ugly mess of data points that I didn't show you, is there really pattern that's hidden because I'm not capturing exactly the right interaction of these variables? Could be. I'm a little skeptical, but I just don't have any, I don't have any real theory that tells me what that interaction should be. And short of a good carbon model that I could apply at sort of a daily, hourly time step and spin up and predict carbon gain, this is something I used to do, but I don't do anymore, and no one else really does it anymore. But that literature, a lot of good Scandinavians were doing a lot of these models 20 years ago, and they sort of disappeared. I don't know what they all do now, actually. They all retired. I mean, are people doing those models?
Yeah, sure. But I'm working with one of these models now,
Okay.
and it's more the reverse. We use architecture and what we know well from the tree, and give up a little bit the ecophysiology and photosynthesis driving process, and it works better.
Okay.
And maybe just to finish on that, I'm pretty agree with you with this skeptical view of what is about the impact of climate change, but maybe looking at those interactions and some emergent possibility of interactions, I keep in mind that some stuff may happen and will emerge that we don't know about.
Yeah, right. Models are really poor at capturing something that's not in the model. It's sort of a trite way of saying that, but that's the problem with models. You have to, the art of modeling is what you leave out, and hoping that what you left out didn't matter. And so, so here's the other side of this. It's my job to stand up here and defend the model and convince you. Really, that's the way science works. And it's your job to find holes in it, right? And that's what you're doing, and that's what you should be doing. And so, but the fact of the matter is, if I could show big effects, this would have been in Science or Nature 2 years ago, folks. So that confirmation bias is real, and it's something we're not dealing with well. It's an inevitable part of the review process and the publication process. And I'm not happy that I don't have climate change effect. I am sort of. I serve on a nature conservancy board in the Adirondacks, just south of here. So most of the board members, these are CEOs of big corporations or the Wall Street types, and I'm a couple there. 3 of us we were all graduate students together at Wisconsin, and we're the 3 scientists on the board. But I was starting to hear these folks say, "Why are we trying to protect these forests? They're all going to be gone in 50 years because of climate change." Now these are people who, run huge corporations and have a lot of power, and I didn't want them saying, "Well, we don't have to care about." Forests in the Northeast because they're all going to be gone, and it's all going to be southern red oak and loblolly pine. I didn't want them. That struck me as just as worrisome as underestimating the effect of climate change. So.
François?
Yeah, Charlie, I'm warming up to the idea that forests are just resistant to climate change, but to some extent we can say that the forest are also resistant to insects and pathogens. And as we discussed this morning, the combination of the two might be just too much, and then there's collapse behind that.
Yeah.
I want to give a little bit of food to the climate believer as well. And we're just coming out from a very wide-scale white birch decline. By a show of hands, how many people here would know about it? Yeah, well, white birch from Sudbury to Quebec City, almost all down. Okay.
Yeah. Christian told me about this last night, and I had never heard about it.
Who noticed that?
Yeah.
A few specialist person, aware person, but no one. So much of your data are coming from inventory plots that have been measured twice, right? What about?
Well, most of them have actually been measured 6 or 8 times. I was only using the most recent data to fit
Okay,
these
what
models.
about all those plots that were only measured once because they collapsed?
Well, no, they would have been remeasured, and that would have shown up. They don't
Okay.
stop measuring a plot. In fact, if
Okay.
it's a parking lot, they still go out and confirm that it's still a parking lot.
Okay, good.
Yeah, no,
Then
they,
my point is moved.
Field
Because
crew
here,
loves
I
the
don't
parking
believe
lot
that, I'm
plots.
not sure, I'm not
You drop
particular.
half of the points.
yeah.
Parking
I'm
lot.
not sure, but the inventory here seems to me, in the inventory here, the first inventory here, it seems to me that once a plot is not with the trees that were once measured,
Huh.
it's not measured, it's not
Huh.
reported.
Huh.
I'm not sure. No? Well, that's what I've not seen. I've not seen that on the field. But anyway.
Charlie, just a question about the model, since you challenged us to challenge you.
Mhm.
Did you say that there's no dispersion limitation?
Yeah,
So that's it. That you
so
can
I'm being as liberal as I can to get
No, but
climate change.
then I have a concern, because if you go to an area where you have by chance or by logging only 1 or 2 species,
Mhm.
and these species happen to be a bit more sensitive to climate change, then locally, you may have a collapse, but not globally. Because
Yeah.
what you're
Yeah,
saying is
no,
that
that's
this
fair.
stand could get any species,
Right.
and any species can grow. Of course, then you will always get something.
Mhm.
And on the landscape, there's no problem.
that's
But maybe
interesting.
the problem is not that the landscape is more
Stand by stand.
stand by stand. There might be areas where we should be concerned. Not globally, but
Yeah.
more
Exactly.
local.
That's a good point. That's really cool. Could we write that down, because I will forget it before.
I'll repeat it for you.
Email me, because that's actually very cool. No, so this really helps folks. I mean, I sit in my office alone. It's me and Laura. This is the first work I've done in decades where it's really just me and Laura, because my collaborators on this are economists and sociologists, and they don't know anything about trees. And so I've been torturing myself for 3 years. I should have published this work 3 years ago, frankly. I've tried we're working on models to look at the effects of climate on the competitive interactions, and that actually shows up as significant. So the competitive effect of a beech on a maple varies along the climate gradient. We haven't yet plugged that into the model. That'll come in a couple of weeks. I have to say, I don't think it'll change the story. But so the question of whether I'm essentially getting sort of a compensatory,
At the original scale.
yeah, right, because I'm giving it a species pool that, it's just that these species
And
don't.
especially you have even more species than we have. We have less species,
Yeah, yeah.
maybe even
Yeah.
more
Mhm.
more important
It's easy to-
climatic gradient,
Yeah.
maybe, or effect.
Yeah.
So
It's easy to do runs where we turn off, because we didn't want to be limiting the climate response by imposing dispersal limitation. And so, but it's easy to turn off the term in the model that says, check and see if the climate is even remotely suitable for this species. And if it is, ask how many seedlings would be there in the absence of parents.
Because I'll tell you why, we did a study in central Quebec where we're looking at how resilient will this forest be to climate change, to bugs and insects. We're working on a paper. And there were stands, no problem. There were stands that have been clearing everything out. They only have sugar maple. And around, we don't have the species that we feel could come in and make this stand actually a stand if some catastrophe happens. So I think we basically say these are the vulnerable stands within your landscape, and you should do something there. Not everywhere. There's many places.
Yeah,
There's
no, that's
enough.
really cool.
So,
So it's essentially a diversity, it's
Yeah.
sort of a species pool effect that might,
But maybe it's diverse everywhere enough that it's not a concern.
well,
I don't know.
no, it's not. There's patchiness in the distribution. In fact, as you go towards the range limit of a species, what changes is not the relative abundance, if present, but where you find it. So it becomes, this was a paper I published a couple of years ago, and it's the frequency, how many stands does it occur in, that gets really tails off. If sugar maple, if it's in a stand, it's always, its average abundance is the same at the northern as the southern end of its range. There's no variation at all. This isn't true for western species, but it is for eastern species. But near the edge of its range, you'll only find sugar maple in 2 or 5% of the stands instead of 30% of the stands. So as you get to the edges of the ranges, you'd have many, many more places where you wouldn't have that species, and maybe it would do well if there. And SORTIE actually says, well, there will be some seedlings. Now, they have to compete with the other seedlings that are there, so we give it sort of this full, it's not true that it's full, it's based on what would that climate have. So the models have an intercept. So in other words, what's the chance of finding a seedling if there are no adults in the plot? So it's a very small number, and then they have to grow.
Now, just before another question, you told me a different story about SORTIE. You said that it was done during the Iraq War,
Yeah,
where the
right.
planes were doing sorties.
Right. That's
So now we should use these plants so they will do sortie, then put seeds everywhere.
And everywhere.
Every-
Yeah, then that would test the model. So.
Maybe just to explain us a little bit more how SORTIE works. What happens in SORTIE in a stand that is invaded by bark beet disease, and where you have a lot of beech saplings? What happens in that stand, for example?
So the way to think about SORTIE is it's just bookkeeping. So there are functions that predict how many new seedlings occur in any time step and where they occur based on where the parents are. And then over time, every individual has growth and death applied to it based on competition and shading and nitrogen deposition and so forth. And then for what we do is, we're basically, for beech bark disease, for instance, so for emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid, it's really easy. We use a stochastic function to say when that arrives in the stand. And then, we've done literature reviews, and so within roughly 5 years of the arrival of emerald ash borer, most of your ash trees are going to be dead. So you don't have to worry about the growth effect. You don't bother. You just, you kill them stochastically. And then in the model, we can allow some fraction of them to linger. There are these lingering ash trees that take a longer time to die. But to be honest, for a successional dynamic, none of that matters. You might as well just kill them a year all in 1 year. You wouldn't change the dynamics at all. You might. It's never a dominant species. But for beech bark disease, what we do is, we compare areas where beech bark has been long endemic, and we look at the growth and survival. Compare that to areas where it's not in the same climate. So luckily, we can get, we can compare the northeastern U.S. with the north central U.S. where beech is present in the same climate, but there's no beech bark disease. And so we just do that comparison, and once beech bark disease arrives, then we start to alter its growth and survival and size dependence. So the effect of beech bark disease varies with the size of the stem. And so, it's just bookkeeping. But
do you see that a real forest will recover from it or not?
Well, if it's a question of what you mean by recovery. The biomass of beech can be quite high, but they just don't get much bigger than about this, right? They get heavily diseased and they die, but there's a lot of beech biomass in there. Recruitment is high.
Okay, that's a good example, because for me this is a collapse.
Yeah, well, no, I think
it's a commercial collapse.
Yeah,
a commercial collapse.
No, because there are studies that show that the biodiversity in these stands goes down.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
all the
The beech drives everybody out. Actually, it's not an economic collapse because those trees grow faster than anything out there. Those beech, if you were coppicing those for pulp for high quality mills like a Ticonderoga, this stuff, nothing grows close to the growth rate of these beech sprouts. They get up to about yay big in 15, 20 years. There's awesome biomass. They're just not producing mast for wildlife, and they're not producing big trees. But foresters didn't want big beech trees. They didn't want little beech trees. They just didn't want beech trees. And now the beech we have, we cut, we sell it to Europe. They turn it into furniture, and we buy it back as European beech furniture, right? So, but whether or not it's a collapse, it's certainly a state change in the forest, and that's going to be the big. And Christian and I were talking about this. It's depressing, but emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid, they're going to essentially decimate for ash, for us it's 5 species, maybe a little fewer for you, but western U.S. there are almost a dozen endemic ash species. They're mostly riparian species, and it's going to get out there too, folks. It may take a much longer time because there's a pretty big dispersal barrier, but they're just going to be gone and they're going to be replaced by something else. And so that's sort of depressing. I think you're actually protected against woolly adelgid for at least 50 to 100 years because your winter temperatures are, the northern limit of the hemlock woolly adelgid is at my office. Literally, the trees I look at are on the line. They got a bad infestation 3 or 4 years ago. A winter 2 years ago killed them back, and so we're literally right at the line. And I'm about good 7 or 8 degrees C warmer than where we are.
So we're okay for a while.
Could you just show us the graphs where you were putting the biomass change and what each species? Yeah, this one.
This one? Next one down.
Next one, yeah.
So I'm just using the standard acronyms for species, genus, and species.
No, I just wanted to see.
Oh, okay, sure. I mean, I have hundreds of these I can mail you by forest type, by state.
I see beauty in your
well, it's just sort of. This is also. This gets back to Christian's point. Any one stand is this because remember these things are being harvested. And an average, new entry into the stand is only 15 to 20 years because they're coming in and taking 15 to 30% of the biomass every 30 to 50 years maybe, and then there are lighter cuts more frequently, and so any one stand is going through this completely erratic, unique jigsaw of change. And all I'm showing you here is an average across 5,000 stands. And so it's got that nice, smooth pattern. And I just can't figure out how to wrap my mind around the individual output, to be honest. It's 5 terabytes of output. You know, sort of every tree, what happened to it, whether it died from an insect or, you know.
Now, I'll make an analogy, a bad analogy, but you know, in our society, a lot of people are becoming fat, and a lot of people are very thin. But on average, maybe we're not
Yeah,
changing.
right, yeah.
But there is a crisis.
Yeah.
We're changing.
I like this stuff about the paper about the socio-ecological models on harvesting. Just wondering about some questions on the sprouting of the excerpt in the area where you are. How much make up of that pattern and how it will be changing in the next 150 years?
It's funny. It's most of the geographers have concluded that we've sort of reached stasis on land use history in the northeastern U.S. We're sort of gaining a little bit of forest land on the fringes where there's a little bit of abandonment of agricultural land, but very little. And we have had very, very, very little clearing for second home development in the last 20 years in the northeastern U.S. It's just, so we've sort of plateaued. We're at about 55% forested in the northeastern 9 states. It's actually a little higher. It's closer to 60 in just the northeastern 9 states. It drops down if you consider more southern states. And so the question is, what's going to happen to that? I have a hard time seeing the amount of forest drop much. But the nice thing about this is this is telling you what's happening to a hectare. And so if you have some model, and the economists run these models, and they're always really wrong. So we just did an analysis. Every 10 years, the national government is required by law to produce an assessment of the forest resources of the U.S. and what's going to happen to them over the next 30, 40 years. So this is heavily involved. I spent 3 years with our EPA trying to come up with an accounting scheme for carbon for biomass energy. Horrible process, really political and intractable. Just, you'd think carbon science would solve this, but it doesn't. But at any rate, their estimates of the future for both land cover and forest biomass are never better than just assuming no change at all. And they're often off by 200% in their estimates. And it's partly because every 10 years when it's time to do this, half of the scientists in the Forest Service arrange a sabbatic to Borneo or someplace so that they don't have to do this. No, I'm not kidding. Rich Birdsey, really the best climate change scientist in the Forest Service, he very conveniently disappeared to Malaysia for 2 years when this was coming up, and some other poor sucker had to pull this together. It's a pretty thankless job, but so the geographers right now are sort of, in the U.S. at least, are saying, well, we've sort of plateaued, and you've got opposing forces adding and subtracting. But there just has not been a lot of change over the last 20 years. That's not to say something couldn't happen, but our states are losing population, not gaining. These states are all losing population except for New York City, which is gaining slightly because of immigration. But it's all ending up in the cities. So the suburban, exurban stuff is not really changing much. If anything, we have a net in-migration to our cities right now from the suburbs. So it's one of the reasons why I don't worry too much about it. No, Jonathan Thompson is the new forest ecologist at the Harvard Forest, and they'll do land use simulations and try to work out how that will all work. You should check what he's got a couple papers he's been trying to publish that look at just Massachusetts and go into really exorbitant detail about the pressures in different parts of the state for clearing versus. And I just honestly can't remember what the results are. That's great patience. You must have
thank
something.
you very much.
useful to do.
I promise you that with Charlie, we'll see the forest differently, and I think you succeeded very well. Thank you very much.